Hello, today we are going to talk about alchemy. In the history of chemistry, alchemy is a period between the year 300 BC and the year 1600 in our era. In our previous session, we discussed about the contribution of the classic Greek philosophers, and for that, we analyzed their contributions from the pre-Socratic philosophers and up to Aristotle. Similarly, in our previous session, we ended with Aristotle's death, which is just 1 year after the death of Alexander the Great, and the beginning of the so-called Hellenistic period, which is the first period that we will discuss during the history of alchemy. As a summary, we can say that the classic Greek philosophers developed mainly two theories. One about the four elements, which were the constituents of all the substances in the world or in the universe, and the second, the atomistic theory. Uh, the, the theory which was accepted by Aristotle, and he was the most influential philosopher of his time, was the four element theory. So he didn't accept or he rejected the atomistic theory. And therefore, this was the support on which the alchemy took place. If you remember, according to the four element theory, it's possible to define a substance based on the proportions on the mixture of these four elements. So one material was solid because it contained more of element earth, but material was more liquid or malleable because it contained a higher amount of the basic element water. But even though the four elements were called like water, air, earth, and fire, according to Aristotle, these substances or these four elements were not exactly the same as we experience with our senses. So the water described in the four element theory is not necessarily the same as the water that we can drink or touch and feel in with our senses. It's just the closest material to that ideal element. In that sense, and followed by our common senses and the daily life experience, it was possible for ancient people in the Hellenistic period to, to validate that it was possible to transmute or to do the transmutation of elements. So from a material like water, it was possible to obtain a material like air uh, through heating, or from a rock, which is an earth-like material, it was possible to obtain a metal that it was able to flow during the smelting process like water. So what you can see with these simple examples is that transmutation was not a strange concept for the daily life experience of a person in the Hellenistic period like it is today. Just we know that the four elements theory is not supported by the evidence of modern science. Mm, so let's start with this session for this week, and thank you. To discuss about the history of alchemy, we should place ourselves at the end of the Iron Age and the beginning of the Hellenistic period. The term alchemy is used in the chemical history for the period between 300 BC and 1600 AD. So first, we should describe the impact of Alexander the Great in the history of chemistry. In the previous session, we discussed that Alexander was a disciple or a student of Aristotle, and he was originally from Macedonia, northern Greece. Alexander the Great conquered a vast empire, from Egypt to Persia, and in these territories were located the centers of culture and philosophy at the times, and even from antiquity, as we said in our first session. This empire brought the fusion of cultures as a consequence. And in Egypt, precisely, it said that Alexander the Great discovered the sepulchre of Hermes Trismegistus, and it was full of treasures, not metallic but golden. Hermes Trismegistus, or thrice the Great, has been honored with the invention of alchemy in Egypt. It is said that in the sepulchre was found what is called or known as the Smaragdine tablet or Emerald tablet, which describes the principles of the Hermetic ideology or Hermetic philosophy, the Hermetism. Later, other tracts of this philosophy were discovered and give the foundation of what is known as alchemy. For example, in one of these tracts is described the philosopher's stone and the possibility of finding or producing a universal medicine. After the death of Alexander the Great starts what we know as the Hellenistic period. In this period, Ptolemy I, who was one of the generals of Alexander the Great, and later his son, Ptolemy II, established the capital of their kingdom in Egypt, more precisely in Alexandria, which was a city founded by Alexander himself. In there, Ptolemy founded the Temple to the Muses, or the Museum, which might have been the first research institution and university. This was also the center for the fusion between the ancient Egyptian and the Greek philosophies. The references for alchemy and its purpose of transmutation, or the production of gold from simple metals, are described in mythology and religion. In mythology, we can study the story of the Golden Fleece, which is the story of a character called Jason who wanted to recover his throne in the kingdom of Thessaly. In this story, Jason, with the help of Hercules, Orpheus, the Boreads, and other ancient Greek mythological heroes, form a crew called the Argonauts to bring the golden fleece, or in other words, golden wool, of a flying ram and recover the kingdom of his grandfather, which was stolen by his uncle. This is the known mythological story, but according to Suidas, who was a Byzantine Greek author of the Sudas was a 10th century encyclopedia. So according to Suidas, the story of the Golden Fleece and the Argonauts was the story that describes the search for a book. The Golden Fleece, in his opinion, was a book that describes the art of making gold, which is, in fact, our definition of the art of alchemy. It was from this mixture between the practice of alchemy and religion or mythology that we still have some names in chemical products. For example, from this mixture, the planets, or from this fusion between religion and the practice of alchemy, the planets were named after gods, and at the same time they were associated to 7 known metals of the time. For example, Saturn became lead, Jupiter was tin, Mars was iron, the Sun was gold, Mercury kept the name Mercury, so the planet got the name of the elemental Mercury, and the Moon was silver. And still today, we call some chemicals with these early associations. For example, silver nitrate is sometimes called lunar caustic. However, this fusion was not entirely to the good. Because of the secrecy, the knowledge did not flow among other practitioners. It was not possible to learn from the mistakes or success of other alchemists, and it made it possible to any faker to present himself as a serious worker, provided he spoke obscurely enough. So some of the recipes and the works made by alchemists, they got, let's say, contaminated or influenced by this language, like For example, to refer to elemental substances, they use the name of gods or obscure terms that make it difficult to understand and to read for other alchemists. With the Greek philosophers, we discussed that there was a division or starting to set a division between religion and science. But with the influence of this Egyptian alchemist or Egyptian chemist, the clear division between chemistry and religion was blurred again. So again, the knowledge of chemistry was highly influenced by religion. At this time starts what is known also like the Hermetic tradition that we discussed in the previous slide, in which Hermes Trismegistus is represented as the fusion of the god Thoth and the god Hermes. So you see clearly in Hermes the fusion of the two cultures. This tradition was based on the existence of sacred texts for the first time. So uh, another difference is that according to this Hermetic philosophy or Hermetic tradition, the truth is revealed from angels or from the gods. The gods were seen like idealism, so ideal characters or ideal entities. So according to this sacred text, the truth was revealed and it developed in the context of an early Christianism during the 2nd century. The Hermetism was the strongest religion in northern Africa and Egypt, but it was not only religion and included also cosmology and natural science in what is described as the Hermetic philosophy. The documents describing Hermetic tradition were written in Greek, but the origin is supposed to be Egyptian. Hermetism is considered a Neoplatonist ideology in the sense that it is based on idealism and offered an alternative to Aristotelian philosophy and that later had great influence in the 16th century. So before the 16th century, we can say that the natural science and philosophy was strongly influenced by Aristotle and Aristotelian philosophy. But in the 16th century, this Hermetism and this Hermetic philosophy generated the context enough for the development of new theories. For example, Hermetic philosophy describes how other planets orbit the Sun, which was the most powerful god in the sky. So, in this sentence, which is written in the Hermetic documents, we can see that it was the right context to the development of the heliocentric theory by Copernicus in the 16th century, which was not possible with the previous uh, theory in Aristotelian philosophy, where the center of the universe was our planet, the Earth. Mm, Additionally, according to Hermetism, the humans were created by God, and thus they are in the middle between God and nature. In this condition, humans are able to create gods, like the pharaohs in ancient Egypt, and then it would be possible to modify nature, giving place to the possibilities followed by alchemists. So again, this conception in the Hermetic tradition or Hermetic philosophy of a human being in the middle of a god or the god because it was monotheist of one god and, and the nature made him like with the ability to create uh, new gods like it happened with the ancient Egypt and also with the ability to control in some extent the rules of nature. And this is like again a door open for the development of alchemy. So it was not it was not impossible for humans to transform or to reach the transmutation of simple metals, let's say tin, to gold. Finally, to conclude about Hermes Trismegistus, I would like to discuss a little bit more about Hermetism. Uh, what is known about this philosophy is mainly compiled in a series of documents with the title Corpus Hermeticum. In there, we can find 17 treatises on alchemy, astrology, theology, and metaphysic world. Therefore, we can say that Hermetism had mainly two branches. One of them related to theoretical topics like religion and theology and philosophy, and a second one related with more obscure topics like astrology or alchemy. Because in this Corpus Hermeticum, for example, there's a discussion, for example, about magical practices and the art of making gold and silver. And it is said that it is not a human invention. I mean, the art of making gold and silver is not a human invention, but it was communicated to us by angels or demons. But this Corpus Hermeticum is not the only document on Hermetism, but later, even in the 20th century, it was found other documents and papyrus and documentation of this philosophy, and some of it has not been published. Mm, this philosophy, let's say, it was forgotten during the Middle Ages and recovered only during Renaissance. And it was recovered because it brought opportunities or a second option for the Aristotelian paradigm or philosophy. The most clear example was the case of, I mean, according to Aristotelian system, the universe is geocentric, where the Earth, our planet, it was in the center of the universe, and all the other bodies were around it, like the sun or the other planets. But according to Hermetism, there is a clear reference saying that the sun is the most powerful celestial god, and the other celestial gods orbit around him, referring to celestial gods like the other planets. So we see that from Hermetism, which is an old philosophy or antique ancient Egyptian philosophy, there were or there is the atmosphere for the Renaissance and their discoveries that were done during that period. And some of the people who brought back this Hermetism in discussion was, for example, Giordano Bruno. But to the church, it was seen like a pagan learning, and then it came into disfavor. And for example, Giordano, he died. I mean, he was killed by the church in a fire. Mm, and then this dispute between Christianism and Hermetism, it was strong in that period of time, and it was only after Isaac Casaubon that it was found that the Corpus Hermeticum, or this compilation of the 17 treatises on alchemy and so on, it was written during the Roman Empire. And this is important because before that it was a doubt whether the Hermetism, this documentation, could influence the Christian Bible because some of the topics are similar and some of the ideas. So it was the conception or the idea that the Hermetism could have influenced the New Testament in the Bible. However, Isaac Casaubon, a philologist, he found that according to the way how it was written, the grammar or the way how it was written, it was not possible that Corpus Hermeticum was older than the New Testament, and therefore it's probably the other way around, that the Bible and the New Testament could have influenced or the Corpus Hermeticum, or the some of the Hermetism documentation, let's say. Despite this, the fact that these documents are newer than the Christian Bible, and this is something that it has been accepted after Isaac Casaubon findings. So despite this fact, Rudolf Woodworth he came back to defend the theory that all this knowledge, even though it was written up much later, all this knowledge came from ancient times, from ancient Egyptian times. And this is something I would like to end about this Hermetism and Hermes Trismegistus. But now let us focus on those chemical contributions during the alchemy period in the history of chemistry. For this, we need to finish this topic on Hermetic tradition and come back in time to the Hellenistic period. In this period, probably the first and major chemist was Bolus of Mendes, who was a Hellenistic Egyptian working in gold transmutation around 200 BC. He, as everyone else at this time, was based on the four elements theory, under which it was possible to change from one element to another, and it only depended on the technique. For example, for them, it was possible to transmute from a water-like water to another type of air through the heating of water. So when I say water-like water, you have to remember that according to the four-element theory, the substances that we can experience our senses and what we can experience in our daily life, they are not necessarily the same like the elements described in the four-element theory. So the water we can drink and experience is not the same water like the elemental basic compound from the four-element theory. So for them, when they could um, or when they could heat water and change it to another type of air, what they were doing is a type of transmutation. And in their daily lives, they could see this type of transformations in different processes. Like, for example, by the combustion of wood, which could be more associated with a earth-like substance, they could transmute or transform this to another type of air. So again, it's another type of transformation. And even in metallurgy, they knew when during the smelting process, they could produce a water-like metal that it can flow even, starting from a rock, which is clearly a earth-like material. So the process of transmutation, and finally the main goal of alchemy, which was the transmutation of simple metals or cheap metals to gold, it was possible because they could see it in all the process around them. The search for transmutation of metals, or the main problem with this process is that during this fusion of cultures in the empire developed or conquered by Alexander the Great, is that all this knowledge also gained obscurantism, because as we said, in ancient Egypt, the development of chemistry was strongly associated with religion and the process after death and preserving the dead bodies and so on. So this mixture or this fusion of chemical knowledge and this religion brought obscurantism to the practice of chemistry and alchemy. And because of this, the process brought fake practitioners and the degradation of the way how the art or the practice was developed and how was it transferred. Because now the language, how it was transferred, started to use uh, obscurantism symbols, and yeah, it was not a clear message which was transferred. However, not all the cases of alchemy or transmutation could be treated as fakery. And for example, Bolos of Mendes, they have described the process to produce brass, which is an alloy between zinc and copper that resembles gold. So even though there are evidence, there's multiple evidence of fake practitioners of alchemy pretending to have to produce gold, there are also examples like Bolus of Mendes that could, in fact, give new information for development of alloys like the brass. And if you see, for example, in the picture, it will be easy to confuse. Like if you get this material, because of the color appearance, it could resemble to gold. So after Bolos, the art of chemistry did not have any major contribution during the Roman times. And in fact, it started a general decay of the Greek learning during the Roman Empire. From the works of Zosimus of Panopolis, who was a writer at the end of the 3rd century, uh, it is possible to see that little value was added during the next 500 years after Bolus of Mendes, except for some descriptions of methods for forming lead acetate or some arsenic compounds. However, again in this encyclopedia by Zosimus, we find references to what is called the philosopher's stone that we describe also in the Hermetic document. Mm, Suidas, who was also another Greek writer that we discussed a little bit before, he describes, for example, how Diocletian ordered to burn the books on chemistry. Diocletian was a Roman emperor, and he ordered to burn these books on chemistry because he was scared that maybe the Egyptian alchemists really had the recipe to produce gold, and in that case, then the Egyptians will rise their power against Rome and become more powerful. Finally, in this atmosphere of degradation of the Greek learnings and prohibition by the Roman emperors, around the year 400 AD, there were some Christian riots in Alexandria, and the big library, was on fire and damaged. In that process, then documentation for the art of alchemy, it was lost forever. Similarly, in that time, Christianity was divided in different groups or sects. One of them called Nestorians, who follow the lessons of a Syrian monk called Nestorius, who lived in the 5th century. This type of Christians, or these Nestorians, were persecuted by the Orthodox Christians of Constantinople, and a number of them fled eastward into Persia. And there, some Persian monarchs treated them well with great kindness. And these Christians, these Nestorians, brought with them some of the ancient Greek knowledge. In this point, then now the center of development of alchemy and chemistry changed its center, and it moved first from Greece to Egypt, or this relationship between the two cultures. And now in the 7th century, it moved to the Arab world. The Arabs, they lead the scientific work in chemistry during the next 3 centuries. And in that period, they could conquer vast areas of Asia and northern Africa. In 641, they invaded Egypt and occupied the land. And in Persia, the Arabs met with the remains of this Greek science brought by the Nestorians, and they could themselves experience the capabilities of this ancient knowledge, like when they were besieging uh, Byzantine cities, they could experience the so-called Greek fire at Constantinople. And from this period, there is a theory that the knowledge of chemia, which was the knowledge of chemistry, this word came or transformed into what is known as alchemia, which is much closer to the word we use today, like alchemy. Now that the development of chemistry moved to the Arabic world, we can see that alchemy had two parallel paths. One of them mineralogical, uh, and the objective of this mineralogical work was the transmutation, so the production of gold from basic metals. And the other path was a medical one, on which the goal was to produce medicines from metals. And this path was also described by the Greeks. And they call it Xerian, which means dry. And later with the Arabs, it was converted to elixir and later to elixir. We also know this process or this goal from the philosopher's stone in the Hermetic philosophy, and the goal was to produce um, a material, a dry material, they say, that was able to give universal medicine for the problems of healthy problems of society, but also immortality. So now we see two parallel different paths, and the differentiation in this goal is very clear in some of the Arabic alchemists. Probably the best Arabic alchemist uh, is known to the Western people like Geber. His name was Yabir ibn Hayyan, and he was a prolific author who wrote several documents and books in a quite straightforward way. So he became highly influential even after his death, to the point that later alchemists wrote several documents on his name in the scope with the dream of with the goal of gaining uh, validation. Geber described the production of some chemicals like, for example, ammonium chloride, white lead, distilled vinegar, uh, and with this process he was able to obtain strong acetic acid, which was the strongest acid known to the ancients, and even he was able to produce some nitric acid, which was later concentrated and it became the strongest one. In his mineralogical work, he he describes mercury as the metal per excellence because it contained the least admixture of earthiness, given its liquid nature. So, because it was more liquid, or it is liquid in room temperature, then he concluded that mercury had a very little amount of earth. And with this, we can recall that even at this time, more than 1,000 years have passed since the pre-Socratic philosophers, still This philosophy, this theory of the four elements was present in the Arabic world. So, according to Geber, solids were composed of mainly two elements, mercury and sulfur. And sulfur for him was interesting because of the property of combustibility, is combustible, and because it was yellow, like gold. So for him to be able to produce gold, it was about the process of mixing two, these two elements in and finding the way how they could be mixed to produce gold. After Geber, uh, another highly influential alchemist was Al-Razi, better known for Europeans like Rhazes. And his contribution is that, uh, according to him, the composition of solids is a mixture of mercury, which has the less amount of earth, sulfur, which is combustible, so it resembles like fire, and salt, because it couldn't produce air and couldn't set on fire. Al-Razi had also an interesting property or characteristic as an alchemist, and it's that he was more interested in the medical path or in medicine itself. So even described how to use plasters. So he developed or he designed how he describes the preparation of plasters and how it could be used to repair broken bones. So according to his work, we can say that he was more interested in medicine than, for example, Geber. After Rhazes, it was the turn for Ibn Sina, that in Europe is known as Avicenna, and he is considered to be the most important physician between the times of the Roman Empire and the rise of modern science. And also, it's very important in this history of chemistry because he was probably one of the first to doubt whether the formation of gold from other metals was even possible. So this type of conclusion and approach made him very unique. Finally, at the times of Avicenna, the Islamic world was unsettled. Invasions and military victories of the Turkish and Mongols passed the scientific leadership back to Europe. So the Muslim world became weaker and weaker with time and started to lose its influence in the south part of Spain and different parts of their empire. Among the critical points of this decay was the Crusades, and the first crusade in the year 1096, when Western Christians conquered Jerusalem in the year 1099. Again, this crusade and the conquest of Jerusalem brought the fusion of both cultures, so the Christian culture in the Syrian coast and all the surrounding Muslim world. At the same time, the Christians in Spain retook control of land lost to the Moorish civilization. And still today, great examples of Muslim architecture can be seen in Cordoba, for example. At the beginning of this process, let's say that there was uh, very little acceptance of the Arabic development, but later, with the work of some people like the English scholar Robert Chester and the Italian Gerard de Cremona. The translation of the Arabic work on alchemy was translated to Latin, and then it became popular in between European scholars. Now we are in the Middle Ages, and the center for the development of alchemy has transferred to Europe. In this period, the most influential alchemist is called Albert of Polstadt, and is better known like Albertus Magnus or Albert the Great. And his main works were focused on the study of Aristotelian philosophy and the description of arsenic. Because of his work with arsenic, sometimes he's described or assigned like the discoverer of arsenic. However, this is not completely true because, as we have discussed previously, even for the ancients, it was known the existence of this element. About his work with Aristotelian philosophy, it became so influential that after him, during the Middle Ages and even to modern times, the study of Aristotelian philosophy became compulsory for the study of natural philosophy or philosophy in general. In parallel with Roger Bacon, in parallel with Albertus Magnus, there was an English scholar called Roger Bacon. He was a monk, and he believed that in experimentation and in the application of mathematical techniques to science would lie the best hope for progress, which is a quite advanced line of thinking for the time, and he was too advanced for the context on that sense. Roger Bacon sometimes he's described like the inventor of or discoverer of gunpowder. However, it was not true. What he did was a collection of universal encyclopedia of knowledge, and in these documents he describes the production of gunpowder. And this is an important discovery. I mean, the discovery of gunpowder is critical for society because, again, like in past, these technological advances in the battlefield could change the order of society. So now a man on foot was able to rival, for example, a man mounted on horse and with armor, let's say. So it could bring again technological advantage in battlefields. Another European uh, from alchemists from the Middle Age are Albert Villanova and Raymond Lully. In their writings, you can still see the mystic vein, and Lully was even supposed to have manufactured gold for Edward II of England. Another alchemist was is named like Fals Geber, who was probably a Spaniard alchemist who is uh, the discoverer of sulfuric acid and nitric acid. And this is important because before him, most of the acids were coming from vinegar, like we discussed with the Arabic alchemists. But now with sulfuric acid and concentrated nitric acid, new reactions were available. And just to think a little bit of it, if let's say that alchemists were successful in this mineralogical path of obtaining gold, then the price of this metal uh, would have lost their value. So gold was expensive because it was scarce. So if alchemists were successful, the process itself and the production of gold would make that the price of gold will fall. and then it was not that interesting anymore. However, the discovery of sulfuric acid has changed the world of chemistry to a higher extent, and even more, while cheaper the sulfuric acid, the better it is for the development of societies. So after this, let's say that alchemy began to degenerate for the third time, like in the past happened with the Greeks and later with the Arabs, and now in Europe. And again, the hunt for gold became province of fakers, and it was banned even in the year 1317, like it happened 1000 years before with the Roman emperor. And in this time, it was banned by the Pope John 11, 21st. And like this, we reach the point of the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, and what is known like the age of the great explorations. Like in the 13th century, it was discovered the magnetic compass, and Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492. At the same time, in parallel, Africa was rounded in 1497, and this opened opportunities for the commerce between the centers of development in Europe and in India. So there was a more active commerce between these two worlds, and without passing through the world of Islam. At this period also happened the fall of the Byzantine Empire, so the remains of the Roman Empire ended, and, at technological level, it appears the first printing press by Johann Gutenberg, and one of the first books which was printed with this printing press was precisely the poem of Lucretius on the nature of things that we discussed on the second session. Again, at this period, we find some knowledge that overthrow the Greek astronomy and biology. Like it was finally debate the knowledge of the Greeks precisely on the geocentrism, which was supported by Aristotle philosophy, and then Nicholas Copernicus demonstrated that it was possible, or no, that the universe, that the Earth is not the center of the universe, and the Earth is orbiting the sun, something that was described in the Hermetic philosophy, but without the mathematical support which was given by Copernicus. Similarly, but in the field of biology, there was Andreas Vesalius, who was working on the human anatomy. And let's say that these two works are a clear definition or a clear evidence that the influence of the classic Greek philosophers have reached the limit. And now the humans of the time, the persons of that time, could see that the ancient knowledge was already obsolete, and they could defy this type of knowledge. Now at the end of alchemy, we find some alchemists who already started to shift the main purpose of alchemy towards the medical path. So some of the authors, like for example George Bayer, centered their work on mineralogy. And for example, in the case of Bayer, who is better known as Agricola, he wrote a book which became the most influential academic textbook before 1700s. And this book is called De Re Metallica. and describes all the practical knowledge of mining at his time. The book was published in 1556 and it summarized all this practical knowledge. Another important alchemist of the time is better known as Paracelsus. His name was Theophrastus Bombastus von Hohenheim, and he believed that the purpose of alchemy was not to discover techniques of transmutation, but to prepare medicines, like in the purpose or in the same philosophy like Avicenna. In his name, Paracelsus, he wanted to show that he was better than Celsus. This is the meaning of Paracelsus. And Celsus was a Roman writer on medicine. So he clearly wanted to show that his main purpose was on the field of medicine. He he was also an alchemist in himself. Like he still believed in the theory of the four elements uh, from the Greeks and in the three principles of the Arabs. So he believed that the solids were composed by mercury, sulfur, and salt. And he even said that he was able to produce what he called homunculus, that he was able to produce life into a bottle, like you can see in the picture to the right, the bottom to the right. Another alchemist of the time was called Andreas Libavius, who was author of Alchemia in 1597, which is a summary of the medieval achievements, and he wrote without mysticism. Still, he believed in transmutation. In this work, he was the first to describe hydrochloric acid, tin tetrachloride, ammonium sulfate, and describe the preparation of aqua regia. And also, he gave some important advances. He said, for example, that the the mineral substances could be identified from the shape of crystals produced when a solution is evaporated. And if you consider this today, he was right in that. Like the shape of crystals, we can understand like the basics of crystallography, and then he has some sense there that were correct. Another important alchemist was called Johann Rudolf Glauber, and he discovered the reaction to produce what we know like Glauber salt from the reaction of sodium chloride and hydrosulfuric acid. He obtained sodium sulfate, which he called Glauber salt, and he called it like a sal mirabile, or like a salt which is miraculous, or yeah. And this had the properties of a laxant, and he described it like an elixir, like yeah. From this, he could start a very successful business. So now they could see that the knowledge of chemistry was not only a philosophical or scientific academic career, but also it could be exploited to produce wealth. And in that sense, Glauber was a quite successful merchant. So now we have reached the end of this session. At the end, we saw some alchemists that even though they still believed in the theories of the Greeks, for example, in the four element theory, and now their main purpose was not the transmutation and the gold production, but more the understanding and the applications of minerals, for example, for medicine. In the next session, we will cover the topics of scientific revolution. And at the beginning, you will see that these alchemist, let's say, dream was still persistent even in some of the most important characters or persons in the development of science, for example, Isaac Newton. But this will be covered in the next session. So thank you so much for your attention and see you next week.